Good evening, everyone. Please join me in a warm welcome to the Primate of the Western Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church of North America, Archbishop Hovannisian. A special welcome to guest presenter, Professor Emeritus Dr. Richard Hovannisian, as well as a welcome to the Promise Armenian Institute of UCLA's Dr. Anne Karagosian. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sera Antakelian, Assistant Director of the Ararat Eskidjan Museum, as well as the Learning and Development Specialist at USC Shoah Foundation. Welcome to this evening's special presentation of Professor Hovannisian's newly released volume, Armenian Communities of Persia, Iran, History, Trade, Culture, organized by the collaborative efforts of the Ararat Eskidjan Museum, the Armenian Film Foundation, NASER, National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the Promise Armenian Institute of UCLA. I'd now like to invite our Primate, Archbishop Hovannisian, to open with our evening's prayer and opening remarks. Your Eminence.
It is only right to start this evening's program with prayer. Professor Richard Hovannisian's life has been the reflection of prayerful life. A life which God has bestowed upon you, dear and revered Professor Hovannisian. You've taken it as the most precious gift from God, and you wanted to make sure that minute by minute, and I say this with a sincere heart, hour by hour, day by day, year by year, you wanted to make sure that this life also becomes a gift for our nation's life. The volumes that you have written, the professorship that you have fulfilled at UCLA, as a lecturer to many, many universities around the world, I have no doubt that each and every one of us would agree with me that you have been the voice of Armenia, having born in Fresno area. You felt the history in your blood, and you wanted to make sure that, the legacy is transmitted to younger generations. And countless students will always remember you with deep gratitude. I, as a servant of Christ and the servant of the Armenian Apostolic Church, way before I came to the West Coast, I had known about you, I had seen you, I had met you several times. But thank God for the past 20 years, for many occasions, I've listened to you, listened to your lectures, the most passionate messages that you have given. The one statement which I can share with people who are here today, you wanted to make sure that there is that reawakening moment, the spiritual reawakening moment in the hearts and souls of our brothers and sisters, faithful members of this community. Ես գաղութեմ, որ դու միշտ առողջ ունեմ։ Գաղութեմ, որ շարունակեք, որ Աստծո կողմից ինձ տրված կյանքի բաժինը տակավին լեցնել, որովհետև ձեր մտքերը կրճոններ փոխանցեք ստեղծներում, եւ անձնապես եւ բոլորս իրապես եւ անգերձորեն եւ չեմ սրտով կխոնարհենք ձեր մասնակցությունը։ Բարերը եւ խոսքերը ավական չեն մեր երախտագիտությունը հայտնելու համար, ձեր այնքան խոնարհ եւ այնքան վաստակաշատ կյանքի առջեւ։ Երևաբար համոթով մենք կգզենք անանաց սիրեկում, միասին եկեք կրնակարավոտ կզենք եւ նաեւ նրա ոտքի մեջ հիշենք մասնավոր կերպով շատ սիրելի պրոֆեսորի Hovannisian անունով եւ ողջ եւ ողջ սրտով ամեն հայր Princess, Surbiacianko, Yerestrakanko, Yatsikanko, Իշար բոլորոց, իվանից և իքորդոս բրգազից, և ողորմյան պարարազոս, և մեզ բազմենացես։ Ես էլ իրեն նման խարպեցի եմ զավտս կողին, դա կարևոր անգամ։
Thank you, Your Eminence. I'd now like to invite the Children's Choir of St. Peter Armenian Church's Sound of Children cultural program. The program was founded and directed by Sirvart Kavukjian, who has dedicated her life and energy to her passion for Armenian cultural education. The Sound of Children cultural program was created to instill Armenian cultural heritage and values in the young children, especially through music, language, poetry, and art appreciation. The program is conducted throughout the year and for summer camp at St. Peter Armenian Church, as well as at St. Leon Armenian Cathedral for summer camp. The program's choir will now perform 4 songs, one, Hallelujah, the second, Hayastan, and 2 songs by Gomidas, with soloist Mary Minasian, in memoriam Dr. Vartiter K. Hovannisian. Choir, you may now come to the stage. Thank you to the students of the Sound of Children Cultural Music. That was outstanding. Thank you for sharing your beautiful voices with us. I'd now like to begin to introduce our special guest presenter, Professor Richard Hovannisian. Professor Richard Hovannisian is the past holder of the Armenian Education Foundation Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a Presidential Fellow at Chapman University. He is the founder and 6-time president of the Society of Armenian Studies and has published 30 books and numerous scholarly articles, including 5 volumes on the Armenian Genocide and 15 volumes by Mazda Publishers on historic Armenia. In 1972, Professor Hovannisian introduced a course at UCLA titled Introduction to Armenian Oral History, which ultimately led to over 40 years of his students recording testimony of more than 1,000 Armenian genocide survivors and their descendants. In 2018, it was announced that this collection would be integrated into USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, or VHA. The addition of these special audio testimonies to the VHA makes these testimonies accessible to scholars, researchers, students, and community members worldwide, while serving as precious tools for Armenian genocide education and offering the opportunity for their stories to be preserved in perpetuity. This evening's presentation, Professor Hovannisian will discuss the 15th and final volume in the series, Historic Armenian Cities and Provinces. This volume covers the presence in Iran from antiquity to contemporary times, including the history of the Armenian-Iranian relations from the pre-Christian era to the Middle Ages, Iranian revolutionary movements, and the displacement and massacres of the Christian inhabitants of the Urmia, Salmast, and Khoy districts during the Turkish offensives in World War I, and relief efforts of Archbishop Nerses Melik Tangian of Arterbakan, Tabriz. And now, without further ado, Professor Hovannisian.
Thank you for that. Pastor Shnor Hovnan Serpazan Dr. Ann Karagosian of the Promise Institute, who was a great supporter of this volume, and especially Maggie Goshen, whom I think thought about today a number of times, what will happen when Maggie is not here. And she's been such a stalwart of this institution, volunteering of herself. And then I thought, I really don't need to give much of a talk today after hearing the angelic voices of these young students who captured everything. I have the first slide. This is the book that is going to be presented next. And I'm dedicating this year to my late wife, Vartiter. This is our graduation picture from Berkeley, and who spent a lifetime of giving, of compassion. And I still receive, even today, letters from people who she touched, especially younger students and scholars, giving them courage. So I miss her very much. This is to Vartiter. Next. I thought to do just a very brief retrospective of where my career has taken me in this long life of mine. Serpazan mentioned that I was born near Fresno in a little Kyuakaak, a little village known as Tulare, where we had 10 or 12 Armenian families, all from the same village of Harpert. And I was growing up in a very turbulent era I didn't understand what was going on, but I know that our community was torn apart and that brother was not talking to brother. There were strong issues and even violence in our community. And ultimately, I understood that it came partly down to the frustration of not having achieved a permanent independent state and having to blame ourselves and each other for what had occurred. And there was prejudice of every kind. And part of it was around the Armenian tricolor flag. And part of it was about the role of this first republic that the Armenians tried to create in 1918 and lasted for 2.5 years. But the odds were too great. The supporters of Armenia vanished, and Armenia was left alone in front of mighty armies that it could not withstand. And as I grew up with a degree of idealism, I dreamed of an independent Armenia, and I knew that this country had existed. So to be able to study Armenian history, I had to learn the Armenian language, and I thank Beirut for that, because a year in Beirut allowed me to read and write to some degree, at least to read, to do my research. When I came back to California, I decided to make my doctoral thesis, the First Republic of Armenia. That doesn't sound probably very dramatic, but the fact is that there were no programs in Armenian history anywhere in the United States. And so I had to direct myself and lead myself in preparing my first volume on the Republic. And we spent, with Varter, 30 years of our lives traveling around the world to archives on almost every continent. And her fluency in Russian and in German, in English and Armenian made her really maybe the major author, at least in research for this. So in 30 years at UCLA, my main project, and probably my main project for my life, is writing this history, trying to take the history of the Republic out of the shadows, out of prejudice, out of ignorance, and nobody we find as we study was right, and nobody was wrong. It was not a land of paradise and milk and honey, but it was a land of great sacrifice, striving, and idealism. It was not all bad, as some would have shown it to be, as a land of only death, to be saved by Soviet Russia. But there's a middle ground, and the archives around the world, unbelievable. Young people, listen, I want you to learn when you go home what an archive is. Archive. I want you to learn that. Ask your parents, what is an archive? An archive is where records are kept, records and records and records and records of all kinds of things that we don't even think are going to be important until one day we find they are very important. And so we spent many of these years around the world preparing and then writing these 4 and 5 volumes, which hopefully will give that period of time a very strong basis especially since Armenia became independent again in 1990 with many of the same problems and many of the same issues as we faced in 1918. Next. The second section of my life, overlapping, was to go back to a subject I didn't like, and that's the issue of Armenian genocide and denial. Some people think that professors live in ivory towers, and they just do their studies and write. But the fact is that in my case, and the case of others, our entire academic career has also been one of battle, struggle against the forces of denial. And as soon as I got to UCLA, or very soon thereafter, the grandfather of denial, his name was Stanford Shaw, prepared a 2-volume history of Turkey in which he set all of the arguments for denying the Armenian genocide, making the Armenians greatless terrorists, fanatics, and setting all the arguments for saying there was no genocide. There was only partial removal of dangerous Armenians. He set this pattern, and that brought me into trying to counter the denial, which was not only propagated by him, but by many others, including governments who didn't want to accept what the reality was. And didn't end there. In 1982, when I was a part of the Armenian Assembly and took a leading role in the Assembly, in 1982, the first time an international conference on genocide was to take place in Israel. And then we found that the Israeli government and Turkish government tried to torpedo it, tried to scuttle it, so that the Armenian genocide would not be included, even though there would be only 6 or 7 presentations out of 500 at the conference. But they couldn't allow even one paper on the Armenian genocide, and were willing to sacrifice the entire conference so that the Armenian voice would not be heard. And then, of course, you may know the Turkish government tried to establish a chair in Turkish studies at UCLA with strings attached, not just for any good scholar, but a good scholar that had to have cordial relations with the Turkish government and cordial relations with Turkish scholars. And that was probably the battle supreme. And supported by my students and others, I think when I look back on it, it's still rather amazing that we were able to persuade the history department to give back $1 million that it already received and more millions that were promised by one vote, and younger scholars with a conscience who did that. And so it's been a struggle, a battle, a good battle, and these volumes are as a result of the conferences that I've done over the years on relating to the Armenian genocide. Next. And then finally, in the last phase of my life, I decided to organize conferences on all of the historic areas of Armenia, which we had lost, from which the Armenians had been driven away, and whose memory was gradually getting weaker in our younger generation. I won't ask these young people where their roots are, because most of them won't know. They will know where their grandparents came from, maybe, in the Middle East, maybe, Armenia, that is Soviet Armenia, maybe, but they won't know where the Iskagan Armadnera, Armadahai, Armadnera Uren. And so I started this series of conferences. Next, and one more. I did 14 of those, and I thought that was the end. And I told everyone that was the end of it. That I had done a couple of conferences on Iran and one on Jerusalem, but it's kind of what Padmagan Hayastani Masam Kagasmin, but Meza Basam Fuch. I didn't think that I would have the time or the effort or energy or lifetime to work on this last volume, but I was persuaded by the publisher, who said there are a lot of Iranian interest in Armenians in Iran. You really should do this. And I'm not a specialist at all in Iran, but I did undertake it some 3 years ago, and after 3 years, here we are. And I'm going not to dwell on it. I'm just going to give you a little taste, and if you want, you can get the book and read much more. Next. Here is Armenia in purple. Well, it's all purple. This is the Achaemenian Empire, the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC. Under Cyrus and Darius, they took over Armenia, but the Armenians maintained their separate existence throughout that period. Next. And here are the inscriptions in the 6th century before Christ, where the Armenia is first mentioned in these Iranian Persian inscriptions. Next. Armenia is in yellow here, and it's always been, as you can see, in the middle of big empires. And one of the characteristics of Armenian history is the need to survive by becoming flexible, and now becoming the friend of one side and now the friend of the next, in order to keep a balance of power and to keep your autonomy or independence as much as possible. Next. Next. Now, Iran is this country you see in the south. It is a very large country, and it lies directly to the south of Armenia. It is made up of the northern part of the country, which is called Azerbaijan, and the southern part of the country, where there is Isfahan. Azerbaijan, if you've heard of the word, students, don't confuse it with the Republic of Azerbaijan today, with Baku. Azerbaijan was in Armenian is Aterpatagan. Aterpatagan is this whole northern region of Iran, where Armenians have lived from time immemorial, from the time of the Achaemenians and Sasanians and other dynasties. And throughout this area of northern Iran, of Azerbaijan, were hundreds of Armenian villages and towns, and the main one being Tabriz. It still remains the main town of northern Iran. Next. Very few people probably know that between the 13th and 15th century, there was an Armenian Catholic principality here in Baku. The Armenians call it Ardaz, which is right across from the Nakhichevan and the Arax River. For 250 years, Armenian Catholic princes ruled in this northern area. Next. And here you see a bridge that the Armenians have built. Next. And the Armenian inscription over that bridge. Next. And one of the authors or presenters of my Iran volume, or Iran conference, was Armen Hakhnazarian. Armen Hakhnazarian was a brilliant scholar and architectural scholar. Unfortunately, he died of cancer between the time when he presented his presentation and the publication. But these are the monasteries that he presented: Subtadeh Vank in the northernmost part of Iran, where Armenians go on the Armenian festival of Vartavar in July, and they have a camp out, several thousand Armenians around this monastery. Next. And Surp Stepanos Nakavaga, Saint Stephen the Proto-Martyr. Look at these large complexes. There were so many in Armenia, so many destroyed in what is now Turkey and in Azerbaijan. Next. And a third. Next. So here, if you look, and I'm not sure that you can see it, but to the west of Azerbaijan is Van, V-A-N. And this area of northern Azerbaijan was a very major field for the Armenian liberation movement. And here, across from Van, we find that the Armenian revolutionaries. Goodbye, boys. Thank you for your entertainment. It was well worth it. Thank you. And girls. So Rubina Perumian, I see, is here, has written a long chapter on the role of Azerbaijan in the Armenian revolutionary movement. Are you hearing me clearly or not? Yes? Sure. Next. This is Rafi, the writer, who is from Azerbaijan and who gave the clarion call for resistance to oppression. Next. And these are the groups of young men who gave up their village life to go to the hills to join bands of fedais, of freedom fighters. And this one is the leaders of the Khanasur expedition, which used to be celebrated every year by picnics, major picnics in Fresno, commemorating the revenge mission of the Armenian fedais against the Kurdish tribes who had ambushed Armenian fighters retreating from Van. Next. And here's another one of Nicole Duman. If you're into Armenian revolutionary history, these names are all familiar. Next. And an arms, they manufactured arms in Tabriz and thereabouts to send to the Yergir, to the homeland. Next. Women were very active. This is a group known as the Motto Group, and I just learned that my cousin in Boston, whose last name is Aftandilian, that his great-grandmother is one of these women in the Motto Group. Intellectuals, but also played very important role in being couriers. They were being able to go across borders because they had their long dresses on and they would not be touched. So they could transport information, even weapons, across the border. Next. Next. And the most famous of the Armenians in Iran is Yeprim Khan, because he was not only involved in the Armenian liberation movement, but also in the Iranian liberation movement against very oppressive Tsarist or Persian Shahs, who are known as the Qajars. Next. And this is the mother church of Tabriz, Surp Sarkis. Next. And this, we have a chapter on this very beloved church leader, Nerses Meliktankian, who during World War I, during the genocide, was in charge of relief activities in all of the Nakhichevan, Azerbaijan region. And many of us didn't know, or don't know perhaps, that the genocide of the Armenians occurred not only in Turkey, but both in 1915 and in 1918, both twice. The Turkish armies invaded northern Iran and killed thousands of Christians, both Armenian and Assyrian Christians. And he was in charge of taking care of as many of them as was possible. Next. Here is a map that shows, in the first instance, in 1915, the Armenians fled from Lake Urmia and Khoi northward. Next. And in 1918, they fled southward toward Bakuba and Baghdad. Next. And here were the Armenian refugees in 1918 in the camps near Baghdad. Next. Next. One of the authors is an artist, and she imagined how her grandparents' wedding would have looked like. Next. And this is the town of Khoi in northern Iran, in Azerbaijan. The church has been restored by the Iranian government. As I said, Iran is really divided into two parts. Azerbaijan in the north has its own history and its own customs, its own dialects, its own villages. And in the south, it has a very interesting history. Next, because here's the large country. If you go way to the top of the yellow map, where it says Tabriz, and go to the very top of Tabriz, you'll come to the Arax River. And on the Arax River were many towns, but one of them that stood out had the name of Jura, where the inhabitants were famous merchants and engaged in trade along the silk routes leading to Asia. And so they were very well known, and they called them Khojas. The Khojas were Khwajas were the merchants here. In around 1600, that's 400 years ago, in around 1600, the Persian leader, name was Shah Abbas. He inherited from his father and grandfather and great-grandfather a war with Turkey. They fought for 200 years over Armenia, mainly. The battles took place in Armenia, mainly, and you can understand why thousands upon thousands of Armenians fled at that time to Western Asia Minor, to Bandırma, and to Adabazar, and to Izmir, and many other cities in the West, because of this terrible condition that went on. But in around 1604, Shah Abbas took the initiative and to win back Yerevan and the Araks River Valley, which had been under the control of the Turks. And in doing that, he drove out the Turks, but then he knew they were coming back. So he decided on a policy that is really tragic for the people, but maybe smart military strategy, and that was to burn everything. Burn all the towns, burn all the villages, burn all the fields, take away all the animals, leave nothing, so that when the Turkish army advances, it cannot live for long without living off the land. And we called it in World War II a scorched earth policy of burning everything before the advancing army. And this is what Shah Abbas did, and forced hundreds of thousands of Armenians from Van, Yerevan, Nakhichevan, and Julfa to ford the Araks River and to come into Iran, force them into Iran, and during which thousands perished during this time. But he paid particular attention to the Armenian merchants of Jura, because he was building up his own empire. Shah Abbas built a great capital city known as Isfahan. And there he forced the Armenian Khojas and their families to move. We're talking about several hundred miles from their native homes, on foot, all that way down there. But he recognized their talent, and he wanted to use the Armenian merchants to enrich himself and to stabilize his empire. So he gave them a land across his capital. Isfahan was his capital, and he gave them a barren land across the river and said, here you can build your own city, and you can live according to your canon laws, by your own church, you can have your own institutions, and I will prevent any Muslim from living in that area, which was to become known as Nor Jura, or New Julfa. Next. Next. Here, let's go back one more. Let's see. Yeah, well, within one generation, let's go to the next one. Within one generation of the Khojas being moved to Norjura, and I say this repeatedly because it really does impress and surprise. They were already traveling with their caravans and their ships to India, to China, to Spain, and to many other countries in one generation. I mean, imagine, I grew up as a child of a survivor, and in one generation they barely got up on their feet and barely had enough to put on the table for their families. And here these people were already globetrotting because they had networks of trade which had already been developed. Next. Here Armenian merchants in Spain are offering donation to build a church. Next. This is the Church of Santa Maria in Cadiz, Spain. It's still there, and you see it, and the baptismal font. Next. And the tiles. Next. Now we're in the New Julfa itself. It is the first time I went to New Julfa, I was still a student learning Armenian, and it was really a shock because when I went there, it looked like all the Armenian churches were mosques. Their kumpet, were such that they had adapted Islamic architecture to their own architecture, and also the local building materials were relevant there. This is known as the Vanka, and it's Amina Pargic, the All Savior monastery, around which there are a dozen Armenian churches, numerous schools, hospitals, and other kinds of institutions, all run by Armenians up until recent times. Next. Here you can see the Armenian quarter of New Julfa with its churches, several of them showing. Next. Next. And so the other thing that really amazed me the first time I entered one of the churches of New Julfa was the rich mural and mosaic and tile work. I had never seen anything like this, especially in an Armenian church, which I understand are traditionally very austere and are iconoclastic, don't want statues, want to look straight to the Quran, to concentrate on the Quran rather than looking at mosaics. And yet, look, here they were taking influences from China, from Europe, bringing in master artists, having that wealth to do that. And several of the churches are filled with mosaics of this kind. Next. Next. These are the tiles. Next. And a belfry. One of the authors, Ani Babayan, was born in Julfa and has done a chapter on the mural painting of New Julfa with description. And I should also say, thanks to the Promise Institute, this is the first volume in my series where the pictures I have are all in color, because publishing in color is a very expensive undertaking. So, next. I'm just going quickly. I don't want, I could talk about these, but give you an image of what we have in these churches of New Julfa. And this is in a residential home, so that the tiles and the murals were also commissioned by wealthy merchants. Look at the clothing of a 17th century Armenian Khoja in Julfa. Another author, Laporte in Belgium, compares the models, European models with Armenian models, left the Armenian, and to the very right, the European probable model from which these master painters were influenced. Here you see Jonah and the whale. All right. Next. And now we're at the Vank itself, the prelacy building, Arashnortaran, Joain Arashnortaran Hachurta, and the Nosher Shnurali library, and next to it is a bust of Khachadur Gesaratsi. Khachadur Gesaratsi, obviously from his name, Gesaratsi, we know he is not from Julfa, but he was a forward-looking prelate who came to Julfa within one generation of the founding of the city, and was so forward-looking that he had priests bring from Europe parts of printing presses to establish the first printing press in all of Iran, not the first Armenian printing press, the first printing press in all of Iran. And so he is remembered here with us. And the library, with some, next to the Mokhtari's library, probably one of the largest private library or religious libraries, and a museum. And here we have a woman, a New Julfa woman from the 17th and 18th century. Outside of Julfa, a couple of hours away, there are scores of Armenian villages who continued until the 1940s and 1960s, when there was a repatriation to Soviet Armenia to live here. Next. Here you see women of the villages of Persia. And the wheat, chafing and threshing the wheat, as they do everywhere. And here on Vartavar, the women in red dousing each other with water. Now, I'll conclude with the last section. New Julfa had many cultural establishments, but one of them was a theater, and the other one was the famous painter of modern times, Sampad Gurerian. So here, next. Here you see the theater, the first program of the theater in 1887 and 1888. The programs founded largely by Armenians from the Caucasus, actors from the Caucasus. Here they're performing Othello in Armenian in 1920. And the most famous of all actresses, probably anywhere in the Armenian world, was Siranush. She was world famous, much sought after, much decorated, and she spent a number of years in New Julfa. Next. And in modern times, going to more light comedy translated to Armenian. And the 130th Jubilee celebration of the New Julfa Theater was held several years ago. Next. And this is Sampad, who moved in his later years to Glendale, and was well known for his recreation of village scenes from New Julfa. Here, a village, Norahars, a new bride of New Julfa, a village wedding, a baking of bread, and this is done on newspaper. He experimented on newspaper. And finally, next, Tehran. We have only one large chapter on Tehran because a couple of others did not submit, but this large chapter is very informative. Next, it shows how Armenians in the 20th century and 21st century are surviving by accommodating themselves to whatever regime there is. And they are highly respected. They're given parliamentary representation for the Armenians representing northern Iran and the Armenians representative for southern Iran. And here you see their famous scout unit is known as Ararat. They have here in Glendale also there are sports facility. And what we're seeing here is in the days of the Shah, Shah Muhammad Reza, who was deposed, as you know, in the Islamic Revolution. But here in the Shah's days, you find the Ararat scouts are marching with a picture of the Shah on his birthday. Next. And then after the Islamic Revolution in 1980-81, the Iranian authorities like to show this picture a lot because it's an Armenian who died in the war with Iraq. So he's known as a martyr, and is shown. Next. And finally, in 2006, April 24th, Iran and Turkey have very on and off again relations, warm and hot. The Iranian authorities have to be very careful. And I was there with Varter in 2005 for the 90th anniversary of the Armenian genocide and spoke in their Ararat Marzatasht. And the next day went to church with demonstrators like this. But they were very cautious and urged me not to march, not to go into the street, because everyone was being photographed. And it could be looked as if a CIA agent or somebody was planted there and smart. In other words, that's how survival is for this minority. Next. And the church, mother church of Tehran is Surp Sarkis. They still have around 20 Armenian schools and cultural organizations. And finally, most of the expatriate community has come to Glendale. And here you see the Glendale İran-Hay Miutyun, Armenian Society of Los Angeles. They took that name back in the 1880s because any name with Iran in it in the United States was, subversive, potentially subversive. So that's why they call themselves Armenian Society of Los Angeles, and only an Armenian saying İran-Hay Miutyun. A tidbit. And finally, here are their young people in the Ararat Center in Glendale with their scouts and athletic associations. And so this is a community that most of us don't know because most of the American Armenian, my generation, were from the Ottoman Empire, from the provinces, Kharpert and Sebastian and Van and Izmir and Bolis. And so we didn't know, we become now much more sensitized. But what is interesting, which I find, it was a community that, without perhaps consciously thinking about it, found a way to persevere. Persevere in its customs, in its language. When we look at ourselves 2 generations later, we don't speak our language, and yet they've been doing that for 400 years, and they still do it even when they come to Los Angeles. So this is, I'm sure, my final volume. I didn't intend it to happen, but I'm glad it happened. Thank you very much.
We'll now go ahead and open up the opportunity to ask questions to the professor.
We don't need questions unless there are.
Okay. Oh, there's one question.
Here.
I have one question.
Tell me what you have.
Can you hear me?
Closer.
I just got the book now. I haven't looked inside the chapter, but I want to know, there's a large Iranian Armenian diaspora community. Is there any articles on the migration of Iranian Armenians in the U.S.? Are there any articles tied to the U.S. and or any articles tied to migration to Soviet Armenia?
What is the question?
So the question is, are there any articles that have been written about Iranian Armenian migration within the U.S.?
Yeah, one of the chapters in this volume is by Claudia de Martirosyan, who has assessed the integration of Armenians in Glendale. It's a bit outdated, but it's still very, very useful. Now, there are a number of volumes on Iranian Armenians, the Iranian Armenians. The one that comes to mind mainly is by Khosrow Chakeri, who maybe 20, 25 years ago edited a volume on the subject. Aside from the Persian language and Armenian language, I mean, on Nujulfa, someone by the name of Hovannisian, for example, who was a book collector and whose part of his collection is at UCLA, has written extensively on the history of that community. Okay.
Two-part question, if it's all right. Whatever happened to the Lake Urmia Armenian population? And the second part would be, how many Armenians died during the deportation from the Nakhichevan region and the whole, let's say, southern part of currently Armenia when they got deported down south to, let's say, Esfahan or middle of Iraq? How many Armenians actually were killed during those depopulations? What happened to the Lake Urmia native population?
One is on the population.
What happened to the Armenian population of surrounding Lake Urmia?
Yeah, and the other?
And the Nakhichevan, the massacres of Nakhichevan?
Depopulation.
The depopulation of Nakhichevan.
Yeah, well, the whole area of Urmia, Salmast, Khoy, all of these areas were invaded and massacred in 1915, 1918. Many of the people returned, but then in the great campaign for Armenians around the world to migrate to Soviet Armenia in the 1940s, many of the villagers abandoned their homes and migrated to Soviet Armenia. Many of those were disappointed and then left for other countries, including the United States. As for Nakhichevan, you're talking about what is in what was Soviet Nakhichevan?
More so, how many Armenians were killed during the deportation to Shah?
If it's about Nakhichevan, Azerbaijan today, it's been a disputed area for a long time. In 1914, at the beginning of World War I, approximately 35 to 40% of its population was Armenian. The rest was Tatar, Muslim, Azeri, Kurd. Under Soviet rule, the Armenian component continued to decrease. Armenians left for Yerevan from the villages of Nakhichevan. And in 1991, at the time of the upheavals linked with our Armenian independence and Azerbaijani independence, 1990-91, there were 6 villages left up in the mountains next to Zangezur, right next to Zangezur. but these villagers all had to flee in 1990-91, and since that time, there may be individual Armenians, but no longer an Armenian presence. And as you know, the Azerbaijanis then went forward and destroyed hundreds, if not thousands, of irreplaceable khachkars from the Middle Ages. A real crime. But the world looked the other way. All right, thank you very much.
In appreciation for the professor's lifetime achievement, we have a small appreciation. Oh, sorry. In appreciation for Professor's lifetime achievement, we have a small appreciation gift from the Hovannisian Museum, and it states, presented to Professor Richard Hovannisian for his unequal contribution to Armenian studies and raising awareness towards Armenian history and culture. In gratitude, Hovannisian Museum, May 21st, 2022. It's a little Mother Armenia rising out of the ashes, and it's made of obsidian. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pokrapa Shadzonre.
Because it's Armenian.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.